see, I think I need to go back to here. Okay, chapter 3. Dan dropped into the Spotted Leopard a few times over the next month to check in with Red and to practice some pool. Knocking the billiard balls around seemed therapeutic some days. One night after a church elders meeting that went on too long and too much arguing, Dan dropped by the pub and de-stressed by practicing his break shot over and over more explosively than usual. It was karaoke night and Dan was forced to listen as a procession of wannabe singers provided the night's soundtrack to his pool practice. Some were good, some were average, and a few sounded like nails on a chalkboard. Between each song, a 30-something woman named Bee introduced the upcoming singer and encouraged people in the bar to take the turn singing. A few times in between, Bee would take the microphone herself and belt out a tune. Dan was impressed with how well she sang. He imagined how much convincing it would take to have her sing a solo in church on a Sunday morning. Dan was in no hurry to head back to his empty apartment, so he decided to sit down at an empty table in order for something to eat. He was in the mood for honey garlic chicken wings, and over the next hour, or the next half hour, more people came into the pub and the Spotted Leopard took on a life and energy that Dan hadn't yet seen during his daytime visits. Dan watched as people greeted one another like lifelong friends. Crowds gathered around tables and the buzz in the room grew to compete with the karaoke. When Red brought Dan his second plate of chicken wings, Dan asked if things got this busy every night. And Red nodded and hurried off to the next customer across the bar. Dan watched as a younger couple started playing pool, and he wondered if he was practiced enough to challenge a stranger to a friendly game. He'd only played his father, who lived an hour away in Guelph, not close enough for a regular pool night. Dan wondered, maybe if he looked interested enough, a stranger would invite him into a pool game. And then something happened. The room was interrupted by the sound of karaoke stopping, and Bee asking loudly into the microphone for everyone's attention. The room hushed, surprisingly quickly, Dan thought, as though everyone was expecting the karaoke host to say something important. So Bee spoke slowly and deliberately. You'll all know that our good friend Virgil hasn't been feeling well. He's been in the hospital for a week now. I saw him this morning and he told me to say hi, so hi. And the crowd laughed and a couple people said hi back. He also asked that I sing his favorite song for him tonight. So Virgil, here's your request. And Bee moved the microphone to her mouth, and Dan noticed that there was no karaoke track playing along. Bee just sang a cappella. Her voice was rich and resonated. And Dan recognized the song from the first note. Amazing grace. How sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. There's something vulnerable, yet assured in her voice that interpreted the hymn in a way that seemed authentically spiritual. I once was lost, but now am found, was blind, but now I see. Dan found himself quietly humming along under his breath. And then something else happened. As Bee moved into the hymn's second stanza, the quiet crowd came to life again, but this time not in a buzz that competed with the singing. The crowd began singing along as though everyone in the pub knew the song intimately and had license to sing. Through many dangers, toils, and snares, I have already come. least at the pub, not here. He was struck by the spirituality binding the crowd together. Dan thought back to the discord of the elders' meeting earlier that evening, to the hypertension that seized him during most every church meeting. Then he was pulled back to the present by the sound of a pub lifted in harmony. When we've been there 10,000 years, bright shining as the sun, we go next days to sing God's praise. And when we first begun. Dan found himself wondering who Virgil was, that he inspired this much camaraderie. He wondered who Bee was and where she learned to sing. And he wondered about the spotted leopard and what his elders and congregation would think about him sitting in a pub past his bedtime on a Wednesday night. And then a thought crossed his mind, a most interesting thought. Chapter 4. The secretary buzzed through to Dan in his church office. "There's a Brian Latimer calling for you." And it took Dan a second to connect the name with Red, the nickname of the bartender at the Spotted Leopard. "How you doing today, Red?" Dan asked in an upbeat voice. Red sounded flat on the other end of the phone. "Hi, Dan. Not too well today. We've had some bad news here at the pub." Dan didn't like the sound of that. "What's happened?" "Well, one of our longtime patrons died yesterday, a guy named Virgil," said Red. Dan recognized the name from last week's karaoke at the pub. Bee, the karaoke host, announced to the crowd that Virgil was in hospital, and then she sang a powerful rendition of Amazing Grace dedicated to him. "I'm sorry, Red, for your loss." So Red continued, "I don't know if you ever met Virgil or saw him in the pub. He was usually seated in the corner reading the newspaper or watching the TV or talking with someone, anyone." "Yeah, I remember him. He was there the first time I came into the pub with my father." Dan hadn't paid too much attention to the man. He looked to be in his 70s, maybe older. He had dirty gray hair with well-worn clothes. Red took an apologetic tone. "Well, the reason I'm calling is to ask about a funeral. I know Virgil wasn't part of your church, and I know you're pretty busy, but I thought I'd check to see if you're available." Before Dan could say yes, Red added to his request, "But here's the thing, we're wondering if you could do the funeral at the Spotted Leopard." Dan paused for a moment. That was a first, at least for this middle-aged Presbyterian minister. He'd seen wakes and funeral receptions at bars, but he'd never heard of the funeral itself anywhere other than a church or a funeral home or a cemetery. A funeral home at the pub? Well, I don't think there's any law against it. I'd have to pass the idea by the church elders, but it shouldn't be a problem. Dan was lying, of course. He worked in a church. Most everything new was a problem. "I'm curious, does this sort of thing happen a lot at the pub?" And Red answered, "No, not since I've been here. This only came up because Virgil and the pub owner are longtime friends. Virgil doesn't have any family to speak of, so my boss is the executor. When my boss asked this morning if I knew anything about funerals, I thought about you." Dan said, "Well, let me make a few phone calls and I'll get back to you, Red." And Dan hung up the phone and readied himself to call the head elder, the clerk of session. He hesitated, wondering if maybe this was one of those times when it was best to sin first and ask forgiveness later. Before Dan picked up the phone, he remembered a thought he'd had the other night at the pub. As the entire pub joined together in singing Amazing Grace, Dan noticed the similarities between the pub and a congregation. There was fellowship, care, breaking bread, and a surprising taste of spirituality shared by the patrons. Now there was a request for a funeral at the pub. To Dan's surprise, it only took a couple hours to get permission from the church elders. All the elders were consulted, and fortunately, the predictable naysayer, Elsa Stewart, was out of town. No one said yes, but no one said no, which meant maybe, which was permission enough for Dan to try it once. There was only one condition imposed. No alcohol was to be served during the funeral service. Dan figured it wasn't worth the fight to point out the obvious, that the funeral was being held at a pub and someone was bound to have a drink. This would be one of those times when it was best to sin first and ask forgiveness later. One more, chapter 5. Dan dropped by the Spotted Leopard that evening to meet with Red and the pub owner to discuss funeral plans. They sat at the corner table where Virgil usually sat. Red had a plate of honey garlic chicken wings waiting for Dan. The owner looked to be in his early 60s. He introduced himself as Talbot McLeod, but after that he had very little to say. He wanted a simple funeral without all the fancy talk, as he put it. He said Virgil was a plain-spoken man who said what he meant and meant what he said. The funeral would be on Saturday afternoon with an urn which would sit atop the bar. If anyone wanted to say some words about Virgil, there was an open mic. Dan was instructed that his job was to say an opening prayer and a final blessing, that is, after everyone joined in a drink to Virgil. Dan agreed, saying nothing about the conditions set out by the church elders. Dan was curious. How long have you known Virgil? The pub owner got up from the table, smiled, and said, "A good long time." And he shook Dan's hand, thanked him for helping with the funeral, said goodbye, and left the table. But Dan turned to Red and asked, "Is he always so abrupt?" Red nodded. Dan said, "I was hoping to learn a little bit about Virgil's life. Your boss didn't offer much. Any chance you know anything about Virgil's life story?" Red shook his head, but said, "You could ask B. She and Virgil were pretty close. She'll be in soon to start the karaoke." So that's what Dan did. Without any convincing, Dan found himself recalling B's powerful voice and attractive face. Again and again, since last week's karaoke night. Dan was a single man, and being a Presbyterian minister didn't help with meeting any single women under 70 years old. So when Bee came into the pub, Red told her about the funeral and pointed her in Dan's direction. Dan was still seated at Virgil's table, finishing the last of the honey garlic wings. And when he saw Bee heading towards him, he hurried with a wet wipe to clean his fingers, and he shook Bee's hand and invited her to sit down, and he hoped to God that there was no food on his face. Bee thanked Dan for helping with Virgil's funeral. "That means a lot," she said. Dan smiled. "You're welcome. I'm wondering if you can give me some background on Virgil." Red said that the two of you were close. And Bee nodded. He was like a father to me, or maybe a grandfather. I met him here shortly after college. He would always smile and say hi in a way that made me feel safe. When most men in a pub smile and say hi, it usually means they're hitting on you. Dan felt self-conscious and tried to curb his smile. He made me feel at home, lent me some money a few times when I was behind in rent. He knew what it was like to be a stranger in the big city. So Bee went on to tell Dan about Virgil's difficult life. He was from Manitowodge in northern Ontario. He moved to Toronto around 1960, got married, worked on the subway expansion. His wife died not too long after they married, and his life fell apart. He stopped showing up for work, he lost his job, he lost his house, and he ended up living on the streets, homeless. Dan wondered out loud, Virgil was homeless? Bee shook her head. No, not anymore. He got off the streets after a few years. So one night, in the dead of winter, Virgil stumbled into Salvation Army shelter. Somehow he managed to clean up and get back on his feet, and he got a job with the subway and managed to start over. Dan was impressed. Red said Virgil and the pub owner were longtime friends. How did they meet? And B answered matter-of-factly, Talbot was homeless, and Virgil helped him off the streets. He loaned Talbot some money to open the pub, and B pointed to the chair that Dan was seated in. And he's been here from the start. Dan thought, that explains a few things. Then he felt a bit uncomfortable sitting in the dead man's chair. B continued, that's what Virgil did in his spare time. He knew how hard it was to be homeless, so he'd get to know the homeless guys in the area. And if he could help, he would. It wasn't uncommon to see Virgil sitting here with someone from the street buying him lunch. B looked around the pub at the dozen or so tables. Every Christmas Day, this place is packed with homeless men and women eating a free turkey dinner. Dan was impressed. He asked, do you think that will continue now that Virgil's gone? B nodded, sure do. Before he died, Virgil made me promise that it would. In that moment, Dan found himself wanting to smile at B and say hi, but he managed to keep a professional face, or at least a poker face, to mask his attraction to the 30-something woman who could command a pub with amazing grace and feed a room of homeless people. Wow, is what came out of Dan's mouth. Do you have any experience doing that? Actually, I do, she said. I grew up in the Salvation Army. My parents had me involved in that kind of stuff all the time. So that's where she learned to sing like that, Dan realized. B added, I think that's why he insisted on lending me rent money, his way of saying thank you to Sally Ann. So you belong to the Salvation Army? B shook her head. Nope, not for a long time. I went off to college, met some friends who were gay, and realized I didn't want to be associated with a church that judged people by their sexual orientation. And Dan recalled some of the clashes the Salvation Army had over the years around homosexuality. For years, gay rights groups in Toronto have protested tax dollars going to Salvation Army ministries. Last Christmas, a Kettle Campaign volunteer in British Columbia had a sign that read, if you support gay rights, please do not donate. B continued, I tried going to a more liberal church, but the irony was that none of them had outreach ministries like Salvation Army, and I missed that a lot, so I stopped going altogether. Dan sympathized. Too bad you couldn't find a church with Salvation Army outreach and open-minded theology. B looked sideways at Dan. Tell me, why would I need it when I have this place? And Dan wished he had a good answer. Next week, chapter 6.